A single tiny island in the North Atlantic would conquer a quarter of the entire planet, ruling over 458 million people across 6 continents. For 300 years, the British Empire saw incredible triumphs, unbelievable wealth, and staggering cruelty. Here's what life was really like at the centre of the largest empire in human history. So, yeah, if these stories work for you, subscribe. And I'm curious, what time is it where you are? Comment below. Got comments from Seattle to Stockholm last time. The time zone thing never stops being weird to me. Alright, tonight it's the British Empire. But hold up though. Get cozy first. Adjust those pillows. Pull up that blanket. Trust me, once we get going, you won't want to move. Your eyes flutter open in the darkness. It's still hours before dawn, and the bitter cold of a 9th century English morning has already worked its way under your thin woolen blanket. The straw mattress beneath you crackles as you shift, trying to find warmth that simply isn't there. Outside, you can hear the wind howling. Not just any wind, but the kind that carries whispers of something worse. Vikings. The word alone makes your stomach clench. They've been raiding coastal villages for decades now, but the attacks are getting worse, more coordinated, more deadly. Last month, they burned the monastery just 10 miles north, no survivors. You're not in some fancy castle with stone walls. You're in a simple wooden hut with gaps between the planks wide enough to let in both the freezing air and the howling sounds of approaching danger. The thatched roof above leaks when it rains, which in England is basically always. "They're coming!" someone shouts outside. "The Danes are coming!" And just like that, your village erupts into chaos. Welcome to the very beginning of what would become the largest empire in human history. But right now, England isn't conquering anyone. They're just trying to survive. It's 878 AD, and King Alfred, later called Alfred the Great, though nobody's calling him that yet, is in serious trouble. The Vikings under Guthrum have launched a massive invasion, and Alfred has been forced to retreat to the marshlands of Somerset. Picture this: the King of Wessex, hiding in a swamp, while Danish warriors take over his kingdom. The king's been defeated. A ragged messenger tells your village, "We're to flee or submit." But here's where it gets interesting. Rather than surrendering, Alfred does something unexpected. In these marshlands, this desolate place of mud and reeds and fog so thick you can barely see your hand in front of your face, he begins to plan. The marshes of Somerset aren't just wet and miserable. They're practically a different world. When you wade through water up to your knees, every step threatens to suck your boots off. The constant dampness works its way into your clothes, your skin, your bones. At night, the temperature drops so low that your breath forms clouds in front of your face. Your fingers turn blue. Your teeth chatter so hard you worry they'll crack. But the marsh also provides protection. The Vikings don't know these waterways. They don't know which paths lead to solid ground and which lead to sinkholes that will swallow a man whole. "The mud saved us," one of Alfred's soldiers would later say. Can you imagine? Saved by mud. In these marshes, Alfred regroups, gathering loyal followers. These aren't professional soldiers, they're farmers, blacksmiths, tanners, regular people with families to protect. They train with whatever weapons they can find or make. Some have proper swords, most have sharpened farm tools. You're among them, learning to fight with a pitchfork because it's all you have. Your hands blister and bleed as you practice, hour after hour, day after day. The weight of it makes your arms ache, but you keep going. What choice do you have? Then comes the moment that will change everything. Alfred, this king who's been hiding in marshes, leads his ragtag army to Eddington. You march alongside men who are just as terrified as you are, just as determined. The battle is chaos, screaming blood, the clash of metal, the squelch of mud beneath your feet. Men die around you, some from wounds so horrible you'll see them in your nightmares for years to come. The smell is overwhelming, blood, sweat, fear, death, but somehow, against all odds, Alfred wins. The Viking leader Guthrum is baptized as a Christian, and a treaty establishes the Danelaw, a region where Viking rule is officially recognized, but the rest of England is safe. This is how the story of the British Empire begins, not with conquest, but with survival, not with domination, but with a desperate fight to simply exist. Fast forward about 100 years, Alfred's grandson, Athelstan, becomes the first king to unite all of England under one rule. It's the first time this collection of kingdoms, tribes, and territories has been brought together as a single nation. One land, one king, the people say. England. But let me tell you, being united doesn't mean much when you're a peasant tending your tiny plot of land. You still wake before dawn, still work until your back feels like it might snap, still go to bed hungry more often than not. The fields don't care who wears the crown. And England is still small, tiny, really, compared to what it will become. The concept of an empire is centuries away. In fact, the first real step toward empire doesn't happen until 1171, when English King Henry II decides to expand to Ireland. And when I say decides to expand, what I really mean is invades his neighbour. Wait, it gets better. Henry shows up in Ireland with a bunch of knights and soldiers, sails into Waterford and basically says, "This is mine now." The Irish kings and chieftains are like, excuse me? And Henry's response is basically, "Did I stutter? Submit or else." Now, I want you to picture yourself as an Irish farmer at this moment. You're just living your life, tending your crops, trying to survive on land your family has worked for generations. Then suddenly some foreign king shows up with armed men and declares that your home belongs to him now. It's like if your neighbour kicked down your door, sat on your couch and announced that your house was theirs, except with more swords and fewer police to call. Surprisingly, various Irish bishops and clergymen meet at the Senate of Cashel and actually recognise Henry as their ruler, and just like that, Ireland becomes England's first colony, the first domino to fall in what will become a global empire. Now let's jump ahead to 1277. King Edward, why wants Wales? He doesn't ask nicely, he just takes an army and marches in. The Welsh fight back, of course. They know their mountainous terrain in ways the English don't. They use guerrilla tactics, ambushing English soldiers in narrow valleys where their larger numbers don't help them. But Edward is relentless. When the Welsh resistance is crushed, he builds massive castles across Wales, not as homes or palaces, but as symbols of power. These aren't the fairy tale castles you're thinking of. These are brutal, imposing fortresses designed to intimidate. Those walls aren't to keep invaders out, a Welsh farmer tells his son. They're to keep us in. But England's ambitions are still limited to its immediate neighbours. The wider world remains largely unknown. That's about to change. The late 1400s bring a revolution in how Europeans see the world. In 1492, Christopher Columbus sails west and stumbles upon the Americas. Suddenly, there are new lands to explore, new resources to exploit, new peoples to encounter, and unfortunately, to conquer. The English government sees opportunity when Italian explorer Giovanni Caboto, who changes his name to the more English-friendly John Cabot, approaches King Henry VII with a proposal to explore the new continent. The king is intrigued. He gives Cabot a patent authorising him to claim any lands he discovers for England. In May 1497, Cabot sets sail from Bristol on a small ship called the Matthew. The voyage is brutal. Imagine being on a wooden vessel smaller than a modern bus, tossed by Atlantic waves higher than houses. The constant motion makes your stomach heave. The salt spray soaks your clothes, which never fully dry in the damp air. You sleep on hard planks, if you sleep at all. Many sailors simply fall overboard during storms, never to be seen again. After weeks of this torture, Cabot and his crew spot land what will later be called Newfoundland. They encounter indigenous peoples who've lived there for thousands of years, plant the English flag, and claim the territory for England, because that's what Europeans did back then. They showed up somewhere people already lived and said, "Mine now." But claiming land and actually controlling it are two very different things. England's first serious attempt at establishing a colony doesn't come until much later, and it doesn't go well. Let's talk about Roanoke. In 1584, Queen Elizabeth I grants Sir Walter Raleigh a charter to explore and colonize lands in the New World. Raleigh dispatches an expedition to Roanoke Island off the coast of what's now North Carolina. About 100 people arrive in 1585. They build a fort and try to interact with the local Native American tribes. At first, relations are positive. They trade goods and exchange knowledge, but tensions rise over time. The region's harsh conditions, including disease and food shortages, make life miserable for the colonists. Many fall ill with fevers that leave them delirious, their bodies burning hot, even as they shiver uncontrollably. Others develop dysentery, a horrific condition where your body essentially turns itself inside out through constant bloody diarrhea. Food becomes scarce. The colonists, mostly city folk from England, don't know how to farm in this new environment. They don't recognise which plants are edible and which are poisonous. They don't know how to hunt the unfamiliar animals. They're starving in a land of plenty simply because they lack the knowledge to survive. When Sir Francis Drake stops by on his way back to England, he offers to take the colonists home. Most accept, abandoning the colony. Raleigh tries again in 1587 with 118 settlers, but when ships return 3 years later, everyone has vanished. The only clue is the word Croatoan, carved into a post. The lost colony of Roanoke becomes one of history's enduring mysteries. Did they integrate with native tribes? Were they killed? Did they try to sail home and perish at sea? We still don't know. What we do know is that establishing colonies is brutally difficult. It's not just about planting a flag and claiming land. It's about surviving in unfamiliar environments, facing diseases your body has no resistance to, finding food when you don't recognize the plants or animals, and navigating complex relationships with indigenous peoples who, understandably, might not be thrilled about strangers showing up and claiming their ancestral lands. Meanwhile, back in Europe, England faces a different kind of threat. In 1588, Spanish King Philip II sends the Spanish Armada, a fleet of 130 ships carrying over 30,000 soldiers, sailors and marines to invade England. Queen Elizabeth calls upon her naval commanders, including Sir Francis Drake, to defend the realm. Despite being outnumbered and having fewer and smaller ships, the English have advantages in manoeuvrability and firepower. Picture yourself on one of those English ships. The wooden deck shifts beneath your feet as waves rock the vessel. The air smells of salt water, gunpowder, and fear. Around you, men prepare for battle, checking cannons, sharpening swords, praying to whatever gods they believe in. When the Spanish Armada appears on the horizon, it's a terrifying sight. Ship after ship after ship, seemingly endless. Your mouth goes dry, your hands shake, the man next to you vomits over the side. But the English have a plan. Using smaller, more agile ships, they attack the Armada from the rear, firing salvos and quickly retreating. The Spanish, in their larger, slower vessels, can't respond effectively. Then comes a moment of brilliant strategy. The English send fire ships, vessels loaded with flammable materials and set ablaze toward the Armada. The sight of these floating infernos causes the Spanish to break formation. The Battle of Gravelines follows, a fierce and prolonged fight where English ships engage the Spanish at close quarters. The sounds are deafening: cannon fire, splintering wood, men screaming in pain and fear. When it's over, the Spanish retreat, attempting to navigate back to Spain. Harsh storms and strong currents take their toll, and what returns to Spain is a shadow of the mighty Armada that set out. England has defended itself against one of the most powerful nations in the world, and in doing so, it's demonstrated that despite its small size, it's a force to be reckoned with. But while England celebrates this victory at sea, closer to home, Ireland continues to resist English rule. Hugh O'Neill, the Earl of Tyrone, leads a rebellion against the increasingly oppressive English policies. O'Neill is torn between loyalty to the English crown and love for Ireland and its people, but he can't bear to see Ireland suffer under foreign rule. He raises his banner, calling upon other Gaelic lords to join him in resistance. The English respond swiftly, sending armies to crush the rebellion. Battle after battle leaves the countryside scarred. The conflict earns the name 9 Years' War as it drags on from 1593 to 1603. For the average Irish person, this war is hell on earth. Your fields are burned by one side or the other, leaving you with nothing to harvest. Your livestock, the animals you depend on for milk, meat and labour, are slaughtered or stolen. Your home may be destroyed, forcing you to seek shelter in forests or caves. You're caught between two forces, neither of which seems particularly concerned about your survival. In 1601, a small Spanish force arrives to aid the Irish rebels, but the Battle of Kinsale ends in defeat for the Irish and Spanish forces. The rebellion collapses, and in 1603, the Irish surrender. The Treaty of Mellifont grants pardons to the rebels, allowing them to retain some lands and religious freedoms, but it also leads to the systematic destruction of the Gaelic language and the discouragement of Catholicism in favour of Anglicanism. They want to transform us, an Irish farmer tells his children. They don't just want our land, they want us to become them. As the 16th century draws to a close, England has established itself as a significant European power. It's fought off the Spanish Armada, brought Ireland more firmly under control, and begun to explore possibilities in the New World. But the real expansion of what will become the British Empire is just beginning. The 17th century will bring the first successful English colonies in North America, the development of the slave trade, and the establishment of trading posts in India. It's at this point that England begins to truly look outward, beyond its immediate neighbours, toward a global presence. The foundation is being laid for what will become the largest empire in human history. In 1606, the Virginia Company of London is founded to find wealth and a passage to the Pacific. With King James's blessing, 104 settlers leave the River Thames in London on December 20th, 1606, bound for the New World. Try to imagine what it was like for these people. They're leaving behind everything they've ever known, their homes, many of their family members, the familiar sights and sounds and smells of England. They're boarding wooden ships to cross an ocean known for violent storms and deadly hazards. And they're heading for a land most of them have only heard about in stories. Stories that range from paradise-like descriptions to tales of cannibals and monsters. The The winter voyage is grueling. Atlantic storms toss the ships like toys. Waves crash over the decks, soaking everything and everyone. Below deck, the air is foul with the smell of vomit, unwashed bodies, and fear. Many passengers are seasick for weeks on end. Some die during the crossing, their bodies committed to the deep with brief prayers. On May 13th, 1607, the survivors arrive on a marshy peninsula in what is now Virginia. They name their settlement Jamestown after their king. At first, the colonists marvel at the beauty of this new land, the lush forests, clear waters, and abundant wildlife, but paradise quickly turns to hell. The Virginia climate, with its relentless heat and humidity, is unbearable for many. Disease spreads rapidly among the settlers. Malaria and dysentery claim many lives. You've never experienced heat like this. It's as if the air itself is trying to drown you. Your clothes stick to your skin, soaked with sweat from dawn till dusk. Even breathing feels like work. Then there's the hunger. The colonists arrive when crops aren't ready for harvest, and with dwindling supplies they face starvation. The land, while beautiful, is unfamiliar. They don't know which plants are safe to eat, which are poisonous, which have medicinal properties. "We came looking for gold," one colonist says bitterly. "We found death instead." Relations with the local Powhatan Confederacy are complex and often tense. Misunderstandings and mistrust lead to clashes. The settlers struggle to communicate and negotiate effectively. Leadership within the colony faces challenges too. Power dynamics shift, and direction is often unclear. When the bold leader John Smith departs, the situation worsens. The winter of 1609 becomes known as the starving time. Food supplies run out completely. Colonists eat whatever they can find: horses, pets, leather, and according to some accounts, even the bodies of those who had died. Of the original settlers, only 60 survived this period. But somehow, against all odds, Jamestown perseveres. John Rolfe introduces tobacco cultivation, which thrives in the Virginia soil and climate. This brings financial prosperity to the struggling colony, attracting more settlers. While Jamestown is struggling to establish itself, English merchants are looking eastward. In 1607, William Hawkins is sent to establish trade in India. After a perilous voyage, he arrives in the port of Surat in 1608, one of the most important trading centres on the Indian west coast. The Mughal Emperor Jahangir welcomes the English visitors, intrigued by the foreign goods and the possibility of trade. Negotiations result in an agreement allowing the English East India Company to establish a trading post in Surat. By 1612, the Surat trading post is in full operation, trading English weapons and metalware for Indian textiles, spices and indigo. This marks the beginning of England's presence in India, a presence that will grow dramatically over the next 2 centuries. Back in England, religious tensions are mounting. King James I makes it clear that everyone must be Anglican. Those who don't comply are told to leave. This ultimatum gives rise to the idea of America as a place where people can practice religion freely. In 1620, a group of English religious dissenters known as the Pilgrims set sail for the New World aboard the Mayflower. The journey is harrowing. The ship was built to transport wine between England and France, not to cross the Atlantic. Storms toss the boat violently. Passengers crowd below deck in semi-darkness, soaked by water that leaks in from above. Disease spreads in these cramped, unsanitary conditions. In mid-ocean, the ship nearly becomes disabled when a storm badly damages its main beam. By a stroke of luck, one of the colonists has a metal jackscrew purchased in Holland to help construct homes in the new settlement. They use it to secure the beam, keeping the vessel seaworthy. Despite the challenges, the Mayflower reaches Cape Cod on November 21st, 1620. The Pilgrims establish Plymouth Colony, but their struggles are far from over. By December, most passengers have become ill, coughing violently and suffering from scurvy. By March, only 47 of the original colonists have survived, yet somehow the tiny settlement endures. As England establishes footholds in North America, it also looks to the Caribbean. In 1624, explorer Thomas Warner establishes the colony of St. Christopher, now St. Kitts, in the Caribbean. The following year, French captain Pierre Belin d'Esnambouc joins the English, forming a joint colony. Warner accepts the French newcomers out of fear of the native Kalinago tribe. When the Kalinago plan to attack the Europeans, an enslaved woman named Barbe reveals the plan. What follows is a massacre. The English and French kill between 100 and 120 Kalinago in their beds, sparing only the most beautiful women to serve as slaves. The next day, they round up approximately 4,000 Kalinago people and kill them as they attempt to surrender. The river runs red with blood, literally. It becomes known as the Bloody River, flowing past the aptly named Bloody Point. With the Kalinago people eliminated, the European colonists face a new problem. Who will do the labour-intensive tobacco farming? Their solution is to import enslaved people from Africa, and so begins one of the darkest chapters in the empire's history. The slave trade will become a cornerstone of British colonial economics, bringing immense wealth to some, while inflicting unimaginable suffering on millions. As the 1620s progress, England continues to expand its Caribbean presence, settling Barbados in 1625, Nevis in 1627, and Montserrat and Antigua in 1632. These islands become crucial to the growing empire, producing valuable crops like sugar and tobacco. But the empire's foundations are still being laid. The dramatic expansion that will make Britain the world's dominant power is yet to come. The seeds have been planted, however, in North America, in the Caribbean, in India. Over the next several centuries, these seeds will grow into the largest empire the world has ever seen. As you lie in your bed tonight, comfortable and safe, think about those early colonists facing unknown dangers, battling harsh elements, making desperate choices. Think about the indigenous peoples whose lives were forever altered by European arrival. Think about the enslaved Africans torn from their homes to labour in foreign lands. The story of the British Empire is one of extraordinary human achievement and courage, but also of exploitation, cruelty, and cultural destruction. It's a complex legacy that continues to shape our world today, and this is just the beginning. The empire will grow far beyond these early footholds, eventually encompassing nearly a quarter of the Earth's land surface and ruling over 458 million people. But that's a story for another time. For now, as your eyes grow heavy and sleep begins to claim you, remember that history isn't just about kings and queens, battles and treaties. It's about ordinary people living through extraordinary times, making choices, some heroic, some horrific, that echo through the centuries. The British Empire began not with grand designs of global domination, but with survival, opportunity, and a gradual expansion that would, over generations, reshape the world in ways no one could have imagined. The year is 1534, and King Henry VIII is about to do something absolutely bonkers that will change England and eventually the world forever. Imagine waking up one morning to discover that your country has an entirely new religion because the king couldn't get his wife pregnant with a boy. Yeah, that actually happened. But let's back up a bit. Henry VIII had been married to Catherine of Aragon for years. They had a daughter, Mary, but no male heir, and Henry was obsessed with having a son to inherit his throne. "The king's moods are darker than a storm cloud," whispers a servant in the royal kitchens. He paces the halls at night, muttering about sons and succession. Henry decides his marriage is cursed because Catherine was previously married to his older brother Arthur, who died. According to the Old Testament, marrying your brother's widow is forbidden. Henry becomes convinced this is why he doesn't have a male heir, so he asks the Pope for an annulment. The Pope, influenced by Catherine's powerful nephew, Emperor Charles V of Spain, says no. Now, if you or I got told no by the highest religious authority on earth, we'd probably just deal with it. But kings aren't like normal people. When Henry gets told no, he essentially says, "Fine, I'll make my own church where I'm in charge." And that's exactly what he does. In 1534, Parliament passes the Act of Supremacy, officially creating the Church of England with King Henry VIII as its head. Think about what this meant for ordinary people. Imagine you're a peasant farmer who's been Catholic your entire life, as has every generation of your family going back centuries. Your entire understanding of the world, the afterlife, salvation, everything is rooted in Catholic teachings. Then suddenly, by royal decree, you're told that's all wrong, and now you need to follow this new church instead. "My grandmother cried for days," a man later recalled. "She thought we'd all go to hell for abandoning the true faith." Some embraced the change, others resisted. Those who refused to acknowledge the king as the head of the church faced severe consequences, including execution. After Henry's death, his daughter Mary, a devout Catholic, takes the throne and tries to restore Catholicism, earning the nickname Bloody Mary for her brutal persecution of Protestants. But her reign is short-lived. When her half-sister Elizabeth I becomes queen, she re-establishes Protestantism as England's official religion, passing her own Act of Supremacy in 1559. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the race for colonization has begun. The Spanish have established colonies across South America, the Portuguese control Brazil, the French have settlements in Quebec and Florida. Elizabeth I sees all this expansion and thinks, "I want some of that." So she commissions an army of seafarers to explore the world. These men, known as the Sea Dogs, are given legal permission to pillage and loot Spanish ships. One of Elizabeth's first appointees is John Hawkins, a pardoned killer who joins the Royal Navy to save his life. In 1561, Hawkins travels to the Canary Islands, a Spanish colony off the coast of Africa. There, he discovers a horrific but lucrative business opportunity, the slave trade. In 1562, Hawkins sails to Sierra Leone, where he captures 300 Africans and forces them onto his ship. The conditions are beyond inhumane. People are chained together, lying in their own waste, with barely enough food or water to survive. Many die during the crossing from disease, starvation, or suicide. Hawkins sells these enslaved people in the Caribbean, trading them for pearls, hides, and sugar. The business is so profitable that when he returns to England, he's knighted. Let that sink in. The first English slave trader was given a knighthood for his achievements. But Queen Elizabeth isn't just interested in attacking Spanish ships and trading enslaved people. She also wants to establish permanent English settlements in the New World. After the failed Roanoke colony we talked about earlier, England finally establishes a successful permanent colony at Jamestown in 1607, but living conditions there are brutal. The water tastes like someone pissed in it, a colonist writes home, because someone probably did. The Jamestown settlement is located on a swampy peninsula with brackish water that makes everyone sick. Mosquitoes bring malaria. Poor sanitation leads to dysentery. Food is scarce. Of the original 104 settlers, only 38 survived the first year. John Smith, one of the colony's leaders, enforces strict rules to keep the settlement alive. He who does not work does not eat. This doesn't make him popular, but it keeps people alive. The colony's fortunes change when John Rolfe introduces a strain of tobacco that thrives in Virginia soil. Suddenly Jamestown has a cash crop. The demand for labour grows, and in 1619 the first ship carrying enslaved Africans arrives in Virginia. Around the same time, another group of English settlers is preparing to leave for America, not for gold or tobacco, but for religious freedom. The Puritans believe the Church of England hasn't gone far enough in removing Catholic influences. They face persecution under King James I and his son Charles the Fern, who demand strict adherence to Anglican practices. In 1620, a group of these dissenters, known as the Pilgrims, sets sail on the Mayflower. After a miserable 66-day journey across the Atlantic, they land at what becomes Plymouth, Massachusetts. The first winter is devastating. Half the colonists die from cold, starvation, and disease. Imagine huddling in a crude shelter as the temperature drops below freezing. The wind finds every gap in the rough-hewn walls. Your fingers and toes go numb. Your breath forms clouds in the frigid air. Your stomach gnaws with hunger. "We buried the dead in unmarked graves at night," one survivor later wrote, "so the Indians wouldn't know how many we had lost." But by spring, the situation improves. The local Wampanoag people, led by Massasoit, teach the survivors how to plant corn, catch fish, and hunt game. The colony slowly grows. 10 years later, a much larger group of Puritans arrives, establishing the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Unlike the Pilgrims, these Puritans don't seek to separate from the Church of England. They want to purify it. And they believe their new colony will be an example to the world. "We shall be as a city upon a hill," declares John Winthrop, their leader. "The eyes of all people are upon us." But this city upon a hill isn't exactly a beacon of tolerance. The Puritans establish a society based on their strict religious beliefs. Anyone who deviates faces punishment or exile. The Puritans came to America for religious freedom, a later historian quips. The freedom to practice their religion and forbid everyone else from practicing theirs. The religious zeal is so intense that some, like Roger Williams and Thomas Hooker, break away to establish more tolerant colonies in Rhode Island and Connecticut. While the Puritans are building their godly society in New England, the English are also expanding into the Caribbean. In 1624, they establish a colony on St. Kitts, followed by settlements on Barbados, Nevis, Montserrat, and Antigua. These islands become enormously profitable thanks to one crop, sugar. But sugar cultivation is brutally labour-intensive. The work involves clearing land, planting, weeding, and harvesting in the scorching tropical heat. European colonists, unaccustomed to the climate and susceptible to tropical diseases, quickly turn to enslaved African labour. Life for an enslaved person on a Caribbean sugar plantation is hell on earth. You wake before dawn and work until sunset in temperatures that regularly exceed 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Your back bleeds from the overseer's whip. Your hands are raw and blistered from cutting sugarcane with a machete. You're given barely enough food to survive. At night, you collapse in a crude hut, only to repeat the process the next day, and the next, and the next. "You don't get used to it," an enslaved man later testifies. "You just learn to survive it." The death rate on sugar plantations is so high that plantation owners find it more economical to work people to death and replace them than to maintain their health. It's one of the most brutal labour systems in human history. By the 1640s, Barbados has been transformed from a relatively diverse society of small farmers to a slave colony dominated by large plantations. The island becomes enormously wealthy for its white inhabitants. In 1645, there are 5,680 enslaved Africans on Barbados. By 1668, there are over 40,000. Back in England, religious tensions continue to simmer. King Charles I's attempts to impose Anglican worship on Scotland trigger a rebellion. His increasing autocratic rule and dismissal of Parliament lead to growing opposition. In 1642, these tensions explode into civil war. On one side are the royalists supporting the king. On the other are the parliamentarians fighting for greater parliamentary power. For the average person, the English Civil War is a nightmare. Neighbours fight neighbours. Families are torn apart by divided loyalties. Villages are looted by both sides. Fields lie fallow as men are called to fight rather than farm, leading to food shortages. "I saw a man kill his own brother," one witness recounts. "They wore different colours, served different masters, but they shared the same blood." After years of fighting, the parliamentarians, led by Oliver Cromwell, emerge victorious. Charles I is captured, tried for treason, and executed in 1649, an act that shocks Europe. A king ordained by God has been tried and executed by his own people. Cromwell establishes himself as Lord Protector, effectively a military dictator. He bans traditional Christmas celebrations for being too Catholic. He enforces strict moral codes, and he expands England's empire through military conquest. In Ireland, Cromwell's forces commit atrocities that are remembered to this day. At Drogheda in 1649, they kill nearly 3,500 people after capturing the town, including soldiers, civilians, and priests. At Wexford, they kill 2,000 Irish troops and 1,500 civilians, burning the town to ashes. "They killed everyone," a survivor recalls. "Men, women, children. They showed no mercy." Cromwell then turns his attention to Scotland, defeating the Scottish royalists who support Charles II, the executed king's son. By 1653, Cromwell controls England, Scotland, and Ireland, the foundation of what will later be called the United Kingdom. Despite his domestic brutality, Cromwell expands England's overseas possessions. In 1655, English forces capture Jamaica from Spain, adding another valuable sugar island to the empire. After Cromwell's death in 1658, the monarchy is restored with Charles II as king. Charles continues the imperial expansion, establishing the Royal African Company to monopolise the gold and slave trades in Africa. He also grants a charter for Carolina, named after himself, creating a buffer between the English colonies and Spanish Florida. In 1664, English forces capture New Amsterdam from the Dutch, renaming it New York. By the end of the 17th century, England controls a string of colonies along the eastern seaboard of North America, from New Hampshire to Carolina. The Caribbean islands of Jamaica, Barbados, and the Leeward Islands provide immense wealth through sugar production. And the East India Company has established trading posts at Bombay, Madras, and Calcutta. The foundation of the British Empire is firmly in place. England has transformed from a relatively minor European power to a major colonial force. Its navy dominates the seas. Its merchants trade across the globe. Its plantations produce valuable commodities. All of this expansion brings tremendous wealth to England, but at a terrible human cost. Millions of indigenous people are displaced or killed. Millions of Africans are enslaved and transported across the Atlantic in conditions so horrific that many don't survive the journey. And for the average English person, life isn't much better than it was before the empire began to grow. The wealth flows to merchants, plantation owners, and the aristocracy. The working class continues to struggle with poverty, disease, and harsh living conditions. As night falls and you drift towards sleep, think about the contradictions of empire, the incredible human achievement alongside the unimaginable cruelty, the wealth creation alongside the exploitation, the spread of certain ideals alongside the suppression of others. The story of the British Empire is not a simple tale of heroes and villains, but a complex tapestry of human ambition, courage, greed, and suffering. And we're still just at the beginning. In the next century, Britain will face new rivals, fight global wars, and expand its empire to unprecedented size. But for now, rest. Let the weight of history settle around you like a blanket, heavy with the lessons of the past. By the 1670s, the New England colonies are growing at a pace that would make modern urban planners have a panic attack. In just 50 years, the Massachusetts Bay Colony has exploded from 180 people to over 64,000. That's not gradual growth, that's a population bomb. And what happens when you have more people? You need more space, more resources, and more food. So the colonists begin pushing outward beyond their original settlements. There's just one small problem. They're expanding into land that already belongs to someone else, the Wampanoag Confederacy. Now, let's be real. The relationship between the Wampanoag and the colonists was complicated from day one. The Wampanoag initially helped the struggling Plymouth settlers survive, teaching them how to grow corn and navigate the unfamiliar landscape. But as more ships arrived carrying more colonists who needed more land, tensions grew. Our grandfathers welcomed them, a Wampanoag man tells his son, and now they take everything. The fundamental problem was that the English and the Wampanoag had completely different concepts of land ownership. To the English, land was something an individual could own with the right deed. To the Wampanoag, land was a communal resource that belonged to everyone and no one. So, when English settlers tried to buy land from the natives, the whole transaction was wrapped in misunderstanding. The Wampanoag might have thought they were granting usage rights, while the English believed they were getting permanent exclusive ownership. How can anyone own the land? A Wampanoag elder asks. Can you own the sky, the river, the wind? In 1675, everything explodes when 3 Wampanoag men are executed by English authorities for the murder of a Christianized Native American named John Sassamon. The Wampanoag leader Metacom, called King Philip by the English, is outraged. He leads his warriors in attacks on English settlements, starting a conflict known as King Philip's War. For the average colonist, this war is terrifying. Imagine living in a small wooden house on the edge of the wilderness. There are no police to call, no army nearby to protect you. Your closest neighbours might be a mile away. At night you hear rustling in the dark forest that surrounds your home. Is it the wind, a deer, or warriors preparing to attack? We slept with axes and muskets beside our beds, one colonist later wrote. If we slept at all. Villages like Swansea, Taunton, Brookfield and Deerfield are attacked. Some are burned to the ground. Settlers flee to larger towns for safety, abandoning homes and farms they've spent years building. The winter months bring their own kind of hell. Both sides endure harsh conditions, disease, starvation, exposure. Native American villages are razed, families torn apart. English settlements are destroyed, their inhabitants killed or captured. The snow was stained with blood, a survivor recalls, red on white. I still see it in my dreams. The English negotiate an alliance with the Mohawk tribe, gaining a strategic advantage against Metacom's forces. The tide turns when Metacom is killed in August 1676 by one of his former allies, a Christian Native American named John Alderman. With Metacom's death, the Native American resistance falters. The war officially ends with the Treaty of Casco, which allows the English to remain on all native lands in exchange for a trivial payment, 1 peck of corn per English family. This conflict fundamentally reshapes New England. The Native American population is decimated, with many killed in battle or sold into slavery in the West Indies. The survivors are pushed further inland or forced onto marginal lands. The English colonies, despite their losses, emerge stronger and more unified. But not all colonization efforts are marked by such violence. Around the same time, a new religious group is challenging Anglican dominance, the Quakers. Their beliefs are radical for the time. They reject formal church hierarchy, refuse to use titles, even addressing the king simply as Charles, and believe in an inner light that allows direct communication with God. William Penn, a prominent Quaker, sees an opportunity. King Charles II owes Penn's father a debt of £16,000, equivalent to about £2.8 million today. Instead of cash, Penn asks for land in the New World to create a haven for his fellow Quakers. In 1681, Charles signs the order creating the colony of Pennsylvania. When Penn arrives in October 1682, he establishes a settlement he names Philadelphia, Greek for brotherly love. His vision is unprecedented, a place where all people, regardless of race, religion, or gender, can prosper equally. This is a holy experiment, Penn declares. Here we will prove that people of different beliefs can live together in peace. It's a noble ideal, even if the reality doesn't fully match the vision. Still, Pennsylvania becomes known for its religious tolerance and fair treatment of Native Americans. Penn insists on paying native tribes for land rather than simply claiming it, and he learns their languages to negotiate directly with them. While the North American colonies are expanding and developing across the ocean, the East India Company is growing in influence. In 1639, they secure a small parcel of land on the Coromandel coast of India. Don't let the size fool you. This tiny spot, just a stretch of coastal dunes and palm trees, will become the foundation of British power in India. Company agents Francis Day and Andrew Cogan negotiate with the local Nyack rulers to establish a trading post. After securing the deal, they begin constructing what they call Fort St. George. Initially, it's just a few warehouses and shelters for traders. The goal is simple: facilitate the exchange of goods, primarily textiles, spices, and precious metals, between India and England. But as trade flourishes, so do security concerns. The Portuguese and Dutch also have interests in the region, and competition is fierce. The simple trading post begins to transform into something more substantial, with defensive walls encircling the settlement. First came the traders, an Indian observer notes. Then came the soldiers. I wonder who comes next. Fort St. George becomes more than just a trading post. It's a strategic centre of influence, a foothold in a vast and wealthy land, the first brick in what will become British India. Back in England, the political landscape is shifting once again. When Charles II dies in 1685, his brother James II takes the throne. Unlike Charles, James is openly Catholic, a problem in a country that has established Anglicanism as its official religion. James appoints Catholics to powerful positions, violating the Test Act that makes such appointments illegal. He grants rights of religious freedom across the land, which might sound progressive to modern ears but infuriates the Anglican majority. The final straw comes when James's Catholic wife gives birth to a son, a Catholic heir who threatens to establish a permanent Catholic dynasty. A Catholic king is bad enough, an Anglican bishop supposedly mutters. A Catholic dynasty is unthinkable. A group of nobles and political leaders known as the Immortal Seven invite James's Protestant son-in-law, William of Orange, to invade England and take the throne. William lands in 1688 and James flees to France. This Glorious Revolution, so called because it involves relatively little bloodshed, leads to William and Mary taking the throne and Parliament passing the Bill of Rights, which establishes parliamentary supremacy over the monarchy. When news of the revolution reaches the American colonies, Protestant settlers revolt against Catholic governors. In New York, they overthrow Governor Jacob Leisler. In Boston, they oust Sir Edmund Andros. The French Catholics, seeing this as an attack on their faith, decide to fight back, leading to what becomes known as the 9 Years' War, a global conflict involving England, the Dutch Republic, the Holy Roman Empire, and Spain against France. This war spans Europe, North America, and the Caribbean. In America, it includes the Battle of Port Royal, English raids on French settlements in Maine, and the Siege of Pemaquid. For colonists caught in the crossfire, it's a time of fear and uncertainty. Farms and villages are raided, people are killed or captured, crops are burned, livestock is stolen. The French and their Indian allies came at dawn, a New England farmer recalls. They took my neighbour's children. We never saw them again. The Treaty of Ryswick in 1697 ends the conflict, officially recognising William of Orange as the ruler of England and stopping the French offensive. While the 9 Years' War rages in Europe and the Americas, the English are fighting their first war in India. The English East India Company wants to expand its control in the region, but Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb refuses their terms. In response, the company blockades several Mughal ports on India's western coast. The emperor retaliates by seizing company factories and arresting company representatives. The Mughal fleet blockades the company's fort in Bombay. After a year of resistance and famine, the company surrenders and sends envoys to beg for pardon. The price of peace is steep, a fine of 150,000 rupees, equivalent to about 4.4 million today. The company's representatives have to prostrate themselves before the emperor, a humiliating concession for the proud English. Emperor Aurangzeb then orders the siege of Bombay lifted, allowing the company to re-establish itself there and set up a new base in Calcutta. This defeat is a sobering reminder that despite its growing power, the East India Company, and by extension England, is still just one player in a complex global landscape. The mighty Mughal Empire remains the dominant force in India, at least for now. As the 17th century draws to a close, Queen Anne takes the throne in England. The structure of government within the British Isles is unique. 4 kingdoms, 3 parliaments, and 1 monarch. Scotland has its own parliament and laws, but is under the British monarch. Ireland also has its own parliament while abiding by the British monarch. England and Wales share a parliament, with Wales more assimilated into English culture. But Scotland is dealing with economic turmoil, corruption, resource depletion, and an increasingly powerful elite. The wealthy believe they can increase their power by combining parliaments with England. Several Scottish officials are bribed to support this union. The Earl of Glasgow, David Boyle, and the second Duke of Queensberry, James Douglas, receive around £20,000, about £4 million today, to end the Scottish Parliament. They sold our country for gold, a Scottish farmer complains. What will they sell next? The air we breathe. Despite widespread opposition among ordinary Scots, on May 1st, 1707, the Scottish and English parliaments combined to form the Parliament of Great Britain, based in the Palace of Westminster in London. Any semblance of Scottish independence vanishes, sparking anger throughout Scotland. But for England, this union creates the term Great Britain and marks the beginning of what will truly be an empire. The formation of Great Britain coincides with another conflict with France, the War of the Spanish Succession. When Spanish King Charles II dies without children, 2 rival claims emerge. Archduke Charles of Austria and Philip of Anjou, a relative of France's King Louis XIV. The English fear a united French and Spanish throne would increase Catholicism's power worldwide, so they declare war. The conflict plays out across Europe and the Americas. In America, French forces capture Fort Albany from the English. Later, English commanders Francis Nicholson and Samuel Vetch capture Port Royal in Acadia from the French, renaming it Annapolis Royal. When the war ends with the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, Philip V is recognised as the King of Spain, but England gains significant advantages, the Asiento de Negros, which gives them control of the slave trade to Spanish colonies, and territorial concessions, including Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, and parts of Rupert's Land in North America. As one imperial official put it, "We didn't win the throne of Spain, but we won the world." The treaty also cedes Gibraltar and Minorca to Britain, giving them strategic positions in the Mediterranean. Britain is emerging as a major global power, with territories and influence spanning multiple continents. Around this time, the Carolinas reshape their society by splitting into North and South Carolina. South Carolina becomes a jewel of the British Empire, with its fertile land ideal for sugarcane production. This leads to an increased demand for slave labour and the passage of the notorious Slave Codes of 1712, which outline the harsh treatment of enslaved people. The code states that Negroes and other slaves brought unto the people of this province for that purpose are of barbarous, wild, savage natures, and such as renders them wholly unqualified to be governed by the laws, customs, and practices of this province. These codes establish brutal rules. Slaves cannot leave their owner's property without permission. Any slave attempting to escape receives the death penalty. Punishments for escaped slaves include public whipping, branding, ear removal, and castration. "They don't see us as human," an enslaved man whispers to his son. "Remember that you are, no matter what they say." The slave trade grows exponentially, particularly in the Caribbean. Sugar cultivation is brutally labor-intensive, clearing land, planting, weeding, harvesting, all in 100-plus degree heat. Enslaved people work 18-hour days, malnourished and mistreated. Many die from exhaustion, disease, or abuse. Between 1710 and 1720, the English enslave and transport around 200,000 Africans to the Americas to maintain their labour force. "They work us until we drop," a survivor later testifies. "Then they bring more to replace us. We are tools to them, not people." As the first quarter of the 18th century unfolds, the British Empire continues to expand its reach. The North American colonies are growing in population and economic importance. The Caribbean islands are producing immense wealth through sugar cultivation. Trading posts in India are developing into centres of commerce and influence. But this expansion comes at a terrible human cost: the displacement and death of indigenous peoples, the enslavement of Africans, the exploitation of resources and labour. For the average person living under British rule, daily life is a struggle for survival. Whether you're a farmer in New England, an enslaved person on a Caribbean plantation, or a tradesperson in a company settlement in India, your existence is defined by hard work, limited opportunities, and vulnerability to forces beyond your control. Yet the British Empire continues to grow, driven by ambition, opportunity, and competition with other European powers. The stage is set for even greater expansion in the decades to come, and the conflicts that will inevitably follow. As you lie in your comfortable bed, far removed from the harsh realities of colonial life, consider the complex legacy of empire. The innovations and achievements came alongside exploitation and cruelty. The wealth generated for some meant suffering for many others. And the world we inhabit today still bears the imprint of these historical forces, for better and for worse. It's 1732 and James Oglethorpe has an idea, not just any idea, but the kind of idea that makes you wonder if he's been drinking or if he's actually onto something brilliant. His plan? Create a colony for England's poor debtors, people who've been thrown into prison because they can't pay what they owe. Instead of rotting in jail cells, they could start fresh in America. The English government loves this idea, not because they particularly care about poor people, mind you, but because they're worried about the Spanish in Florida pushing northward. They need a buffer zone, and so Georgia is born, named after King George II, because colonizers aren't exactly known for their creativity when it comes to naming things. In November 1732, 144 colonists, including Oglethorpe, board the Anne at Gravesend, England. After a long Atlantic crossing, they arrive in Savannah on February 12, 1733. Unlike their neighbours in the Carolinas, Georgia initially bans slavery. This isn't because Oglethorpe is some enlightened abolitionist ahead of his time. It's practical. He wants the colonists to farm their own small plots, not create massive plantations with slave labour. A small farm, honestly cultivated, is better than a great estate ill-gotten and worse managed, Oglethorpe supposedly tells the settlers. There's also the fear that enslaved Africans might run away to Spanish Florida, where they're offered freedom if they join the Spanish army. If slavery were permitted, there'd be little stopping enslaved people from strengthening the Spanish forces. Picture yourself as one of these new Georgian colonists. You've spent months, maybe years, in a debtor's prison in London. The conditions were horrific: overcrowding, disease, starvation. People died daily. The stench was unbearable. Human waste, unwashed bodies, infection, death. Now you're in Georgia. The air is different, humid, yes, sometimes suffocatingly so, but clean. There are insects you've never seen before, some as big as your thumb. The forests seem endless, the soil rich. You have land, actual land that belongs to you. It's a dream come true, except for the part where you might die from malaria, starvation, or Spanish attacks. But hey, at least you're not in prison anymore. Speaking of the Spanish, relations between England and Spain are about to go from bad to worse. The trigger? An ear. Yes, an actual human ear. In 1731, British merchant Robert Jenkins is notorious for raiding Spanish ships. One day, a Spanish privateer captures Jenkins and, as punishment, cuts off his ear. Jenkins then does what any reasonable person would do. He preserves the ear in a jar of brandy and carries it around with him for the next 7 years. In 1738, Jenkins presents his pickled ear to the British Parliament. The outraged MPs demand retribution, and the conflict becomes known as the War of Jenkins' Ear. I swear I'm not making this up. For 8 years, Britain and Spain try to resolve the conflict peacefully, but in January 1740, Oglethorpe and his Georgian militia invade Florida, seizing 2 Spanish forts before realizing they don't have enough troops to take St. Augustine and retreating. The Spanish counterattack in the summer of 1742, landing on St. Simon's Island. Oglethorpe's forces defeat them at the Battle of Bloody Marsh, forcing the Spanish to retreat to St. Augustine. They came with confidence, a Georgia militiaman later recounts. They left with their dead. But the War of Jenkins' Ear isn't just fought in the Americas. It spreads to India, where the British East India Company and the French East India Company are vying for influence in the Carnatic region of southern India. The British, with their Indian allies led by Anwaruddin, support one claim to the Carnatic throne. The French, under the ambitious Governor-General Dupleix, support another contender named Chanda Sahib. In 1744, the French defeat the British at the Battle of Adyar, showcasing their superior military tactics. Buoyed by success, they lay siege to the British-controlled city of Madras in 1746, forcing the British to surrender. This conflict eventually merges with the War of the Austrian Succession, a broader European conflict involving multiple powers fighting over disputed territory in Austria. By 1748, the parties are exhausted. The Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle restores most territorial changes to their pre-war status, meaning Madras returns to British hands despite being lost in battle. Back in Georgia, the question of slavery resurfaces. Oglethorpe remains opposed, but many colonists, envious of their Carolina neighbours' wealth, want to import enslaved Africans. Why should we toil in the fields ourselves, they argue, when our neighbours grow rich by having others do the work? With the illegal importation of slaves from South Carolina already happening, Oglethorpe's ban becomes unenforceable. On January 1st, 1751, slavery is permitted in Georgia with a code similar to South Carolina's. This change ultimately hurts the worthy poor. Oglethorpe intended to help. Wealthy South Carolinians migrate to Georgia with their enslaved laborers, establishing large plantations that small farmers can't compete with. Meanwhile, in the forests of North America lies the Ohio Valley, 300,000 acres of valuable land. The Ohio Company of Virginia, founded by Augustine Washington, father of George Washington, wants to profit from this wilderness. Young George Washington is sent to survey the land. What he finds is concerning. The territory is already home to the Shawnee and Delaware tribes who aren't happy about British expansion. The French are also present, with forts like Fort Duquesne at the intersection of the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers. In April 1754, as tensions between the British and French escalate, 22-year-old Washington leads a small detachment of troops into the valley. In a secluded glen, they encounter a French force led by Joseph Coulon de Jumonville. What happens next is disputed. The British claim a battle erupted. The French call it an assassination. Either way, Jumonville ends up dead. The French, seeking revenge, surround Washington and his men at a makeshift structure called Fort Necessity. Outnumbered, Washington surrenders on July 3, 1754, acknowledging in the terms that he assassinated Jumonville, though Washington later claimed he didn't understand the French document he signed. This skirmish in the Pennsylvania wilderness ignites what will become the 7 Years' War, a truly global conflict fought across 3 continents: Europe, the Americas, and India. For ordinary people caught in this worldwide war, life becomes a nightmare of uncertainty and danger. In North America, frontier settlements are vulnerable to attack from French forces and their Native American allies. "We slept with our muskets loaded," a Pennsylvania farmer recalls. The children knew to run for the cellar at the first sound of alarm. In Europe, armies march across the countryside, requisitioning food and supplies from already struggling peasants. Young men are conscripted to fight, leaving fields untended and families without providers. "The soldiers took everything," a German farmer laments. "Our grain, our livestock, even the seed for next year's planting. How are we to survive?" In India, local populations find themselves caught between competing European powers, forced to pick sides in conflicts not of their making. The war doesn't start well for the British. In 1756, the governor of Bengal, Siraj-ud-Dowlah, captures Fort William in Calcutta, home of the British East India Company. When Bengalese soldiers enter the fort, they imprison 146 Englishmen in a tiny dungeon meant as a temporary holding cell until morning. The conditions are so appalling that, according to survivor John Howell, 123 of the 146 prisoners die overnight from heat, dehydration, and suffocation. This incident becomes known as the Black Hole of Calcutta. The British, determined to restore the fort and avenge the victims, send Officer Robert Clive to confront Siraj at the village of Plassey in Bengal. Picture the scene. Two armies facing each other on a hot June day in 1757. Siraj's forces outnumber Clive's, but appearances are deceiving. Clive has secretly allied with local officials discontented with Siraj's rule, including Mir Jafar. As the battle unfolds, Mir Jafar and his supporters defect, turning the tide in favour of the British. Siraj is captured and executed. Mir Jafar becomes the new governor, a puppet ruler under British influence. With this single battle, the British East India Company effectively takes control of Bengal, the richest province in India. It's a turning point in the history of British imperialism in South Asia. In North America, the tide initially favours the French, but in 1758, British General Geoffrey Amherst captures the fortress of Louisbourg on the eastern shores of Canada after a prolonged naval bombardment. The cannons roared day and night, a British Marine later writes. The fortress walls crumbled like sand castles against the tide. The following year, British forces under General James Wolfe target Quebec, the heart of French Canada. After an initial failure, Wolfe devises a daring plan. Under cover of darkness, British troops scale the seemingly insurmountable cliffs and descend upon the Plains of Abraham. The Battle of the Plains of Abraham on September 13, 1759, is brief but decisive. Both Wolfe and French commander Montcalm are mortally wounded. As Wolfe lies dying, he learns of the British victory. "Now, God be praised, I will die in peace," he supposedly says with his last breath. Quebec falls to the British on September 18, 1759. The following year, Montreal, the last remaining French stronghold in North America, surrenders as well. In India, the British continue their winning streak. At Wandiwash in southern India, British forces under General Eyre Coote defeat the French under Comte de Lally Tollendal. The French stronghold of Pondicherry falls in January 1761, eliminating French power in the subcontinent. The British also capture Caribbean islands from both the French and Spanish: Guadeloupe, Dominica, Martinique, St. Lucia, Grenada, and Havana. By the time peace negotiations begin, Britain is in a position of unprecedented strength. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 formalises Britain's dominance. France cedes Canada to Britain, along with all lands east of the Mississippi River. Spain trades Florida to Britain in exchange for the return of Havana. In India, the treaty reaffirms British control of Bengal, Madras, and Bombay. Britain has emerged as the dominant global power, with an empire spanning North America, the Caribbean, and significant parts of India. But victory brings its own challenges. The British government, reeling from the enormous cost of the 7 Years' War, is deeply in debt. To prevent expensive conflicts with Native Americans, they issue the Proclamation of 1763, creating a boundary line along the Appalachian Mountains from Nova Scotia to Florida. Westward expansion by colonists beyond this line is prohibited. This proclamation infuriates American colonists who feel entitled to the lands they fought for during the war. The Ohio Company, already established in the prohibited zone, simply ignores the regulation. "We won this land with our blood," a Virginia frontiersman declares. "No king across the ocean can tell us we can't have it." The British government's fears prove well-founded when the Ottawa Chief Pontiac launches a coordinated attack on British forts in May 1763. Native American forces lay siege to Fort Detroit, Fort Michilimackinac, and Fort Sandusky. The British are stunned by the coordination and ferocity of these attacks. Colonel Henry Bouquet breaks the siege at Fort Pitt, formerly Fort Duquesne, after the fierce Battle of Bushy Run. Pontiac proves to be not just a warrior, but also a diplomat, forging alliances among various tribes. By 1764, however, the rebellion loses momentum as many tribal leaders recognize that continued fighting might not achieve their desired outcomes. Negotiations commence, and peace is eventually established. As the 1760s progress, Britain stands at the zenith of its imperial power. It has defeated its main rival, France, and gained vast territories across the globe. The British Empire now includes 13 colonies along the eastern seaboard of North America, provinces in Canada, islands in the Caribbean, and significant holdings in India. But there are storm clouds on the horizon. The American colonists who fought alongside British forces during the 7 Years' War are beginning to chafe under imperial rule. The British government's attempts to recoup war costs through taxation will soon spark resistance that will change the course of imperial history. For now, though, Britain basks in the glow of victory. The Union Jack flies over forts and trading posts from the icy shores of Hudson Bay to the tropical beaches of the Caribbean, from the forests of North America to the plains of Bengal. It's the dawn of what historians will later call the First British Empire. As you drift towards sleep, think about the scale of this global conflict that reshaped the world. Armies fighting across continents, navies clashing on distant seas, empires rising and falling, all while ordinary people try to survive in extraordinary times. The story of the British Empire is one of ambition and achievement, but also of suffering and struggle, and we're not even halfway through the tale. In the coming decades, Britain will face new challenges, including the most significant imperial crisis of all, the American Revolution. The year is 1763, and Great Britain has just become the most powerful nation on earth. After defeating France in the 7 Years' War, the British Empire now spans across North America, the Caribbean, and has significant footholds in India. The sun truly never sets on British territories, but with great power comes great bills, and Britain is drowning in war debt. The government needs money, lots of it, and fast. Who should pay for the war? Asks the Prime Minister in a closed-door meeting with Parliament. The colonists, of course, replies a Member of Parliament. After all, we fought the war to protect them. They should bear the cost. This seemingly simple decision will change the course of history. The British government, thinking it's completely reasonable to ask colonists to contribute to imperial defence, passes the Stamp Act of 1765. This requires American colonists to pay a tax on virtually every piece of paper they use: legal documents, newspapers, playing cards, dice. Anything printed needs an embossed revenue stamp purchased with hard currency that goes directly to the British government. For colonists used to managing their own affairs and taxes through local assemblies, this direct taxation from Parliament is unprecedented and unwelcome. No taxation without representation becomes their rallying cry. Since they have no elected representatives in Parliament, they argue, Parliament has no right to tax them directly. The backlash is immediate and fierce. Colonists boycott British goods. Tax collectors are tarred and feathered, and trust me, that's not a fun experience. Imagine having hot, sticky tar poured over your body, then being covered in feathers that stick to the tar. It's painful, humiliating, and potentially deadly if the tar is hot enough. Faced with this resistance, Parliament repeals the Stamp Act but immediately passes the Declaratory Act, asserting that Parliament hath and of right ought to have full power and authority to make laws and statutes of sufficient force and validity to bind the colonies and people of America in all cases whatsoever. In other words, we can do whatever we want with our colonies. Meanwhile, across the ocean in India, the British East India Company is consolidating its power following the decisive Battle of Plassey. After over 100 years of dealing with the British East India Company, the once mighty Mughal Empire is in decline and near collapse. In 1765, the company signs the Treaty of Allahabad with the Mughal Emperor Shah Alam II. This treaty grants the company Diwani rights, the right to collect taxes in the provinces of Bengal, Bihar and Orissa. "We came as traders," an East India Company official remarks. "Now we rule as kings." This is a fundamental shift. The company is no longer just a commercial enterprise. It's now effectively governing territory, collecting revenue and administering justice. It's becoming an arm of the British Empire, with its own army, its own administrative structure, and its own diplomatic relations. For the average Indian living under company rule, life changes in subtle but profound ways. The company imposes new agricultural practices aimed at maximising profits. Local industries that compete with British imports are suppressed. Traditional power structures are disrupted as the company favours those who cooperate with its interests. The foreigners count everything, an Indian farmer complains. Every grain of rice, every cow, every chicken, also they can take their share. Back in America, tensions continue to simmer. In 1767, Parliament passes the Townshend Acts, imposing duties on tea, paper, glass, lead and paint imported into the colonies. Again, the colonists resist, boycotting British goods. On March 5, 1770, tensions boil over in Boston when British soldiers fire into a crowd of colonists, killing 5. The incident, quickly dubbed the Boston Massacre by colonial newspapers, becomes a rallying point for anti-British sentiment. Picture the scene. It's a cold winter evening in Boston. Snow and ice cover the ground. A crowd of colonists has gathered outside the custom house, taunting the British soldiers stationed there. The atmosphere is tense, the air electric with hostility. The colonists throw snowballs, then oyster shells, then chunks of ice. The soldiers, outnumbered and increasingly afraid, try to maintain their composure. Then something happens. Accounts differ on exactly what, and shots are fired. When the smoke clears, 5 colonists lie dead or dying in the snow, their blood staining the white ground red. "Murder," someone shouts. "The redcoats have murdered our brothers." The news spreads through the colonies like wildfire. Paul Revere creates an engraving depicting the incident as a deliberate massacre, with British soldiers firing in unison into a peaceful crowd. It's propaganda, but effective propaganda. In an unexpected twist, John Adams, a leading voice for colonial rights, agrees to defend the British soldiers at trial. Despite his personal feelings about British policies, he believes in the rule of law and the right to a fair trial. "Facts are stubborn things," Adams tells the jury. "Whatever our wishes, our inclinations, or the dictates of our passions, they cannot alter the state of facts and evidence." 6 of the 8 soldiers are acquitted. 2 are convicted of manslaughter but receive reduced sentences. The verdict does little to calm colonial anger. In 1773, Parliament passes the Tea Act, which gives the British East India Company a monopoly on tea sales in the colonies. Though it actually makes tea cheaper for the colonists, they see it as another attempt to force them to accept Parliament's right to tax them. On December 16th, 1773, a group of colonists disguised as Mohawk Indians boards 3 British ships in Boston Harbor and throws 342 chests of tea into the water. The Boston Tea Party, as it becomes known, is a direct challenge to British authority. "I've never tasted saltier tea," jokes one participant afterward. Parliament responds with the coercive acts called the Intolerable Acts by the colonists, which close Boston Harbor, revoke Massachusetts' charter, allow troops to be quartered in private homes, and make British officials immune from prosecution in colonial courts. For Bostonians, the closure of their harbor is economically devastating. Ships can't enter or leave, meaning goods can't be imported or exported. Businesses fail. People lose their livelihoods. Food becomes scarce and expensive. "They mean to starve us into submission," a Boston merchant tells his family as they sit down to another meagre meal. The other colonies rally to Boston's aid, sending food and supplies. More importantly, they begin to see Britain's actions not as isolated incidents affecting one colony, but as a threat to all their liberties. In September 1774, delegates from 12 colonies meet in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. They declare the coercive acts unconstitutional, advise the people to arm themselves, and call for another Congress if their grievances aren't addressed. While the American colonies inch closer to open rebellion, Britain continues to expand its influence elsewhere. In 1768, Captain James Cook embarks on the HMS Endeavour to explore the South Pacific. After years of arduous sea travel, Cook and his crew reach the southern hemisphere. In April 1770, they discover an unexpected landmass, the continent of Australia. Cook makes landfall at a place now known as Botany Bay in what will become New South Wales. Stepping ashore, he and his crew encounter a landscape unlike any they've seen before, with exotic flora and fauna and indigenous people who have called this land home for millennia. "The air smells different here," one sailor notes in his journal, "spicy, sharp, like nothing in England." Cook and his crew spend months charting the eastern coastline of this vast continent. They sail northward, mapping in detail as they go. Cook is a meticulous navigator whose precise measurements and cartography are unrivaled. As they venture farther north, they encounter a range of environments, from dense rainforests to pristine beaches and coral reefs. They see strange animals, creatures that hop on powerful hind legs carrying their young in pouches, furry animals that climb trees and eat leaves. Birds of brilliant plumage that mimic human speech. "If I hadn't seen it with my own eyes," a crewman writes, "I would have sworn the others were spinning tales to fool me. The world's newest and most dangerous frontier has been discovered." Cook claims it for Britain, ignoring the fact that the land is already inhabited by hundreds of indigenous nations with their own complex societies, languages, and traditions. This pattern of European powers claiming lands already inhabited by indigenous peoples has been repeated across the globe. From North America to the Caribbean to India to Australia, the expansion of the British Empire often means the displacement, subjugation, or elimination of native populations. Back in the American colonies, events are moving rapidly toward confrontation. In April 1775, British troops march from Boston to the nearby towns of Lexington and Concord to seize colonial weapons and arrest revolutionary leaders. Colonial militiamen warned by Paul Revere and others confront the British troops. Shots are fired. No one knows for certain who fired first, and the American Revolution begins. The shot heard round the world, as Ralph Waldo Emerson will later call it, sets in motion a chain of events that will lead to the first major loss of British colonial territory. As the conflict escalates, the colonists form the Continental Army under the command of George Washington. On July 4th, 1776, the Continental Congress adopts the Declaration of Independence, formally severing ties with Great Britain. "We hold these truths to be self-evident," the document declares, "that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The ideals expressed in the Declaration will inspire movements for liberty and self-government around the world for centuries to come, including, ironically, in other parts of the British Empire." For Britain, the American Revolution represents the first major challenge to its imperial authority. If the 13 colonies can successfully break away, what's to stop other colonies from following suit? The war is a global conflict, with France, Spain, and the Netherlands eventually joining on the American side. British forces face not just colonial militias, but professional European armies and navies. For ordinary people caught in the conflict, life becomes a constant struggle. Armies from both sides requisition food and supplies from farms and villages. Neighbours turn against neighbours, those loyal to the crown against those supporting independence. "My brother fights for the king," a Massachusetts woman tells her children. "Your father fights for independence. If they meet on the battlefield, one may kill the other. This is the price of war." After years of fighting, the tide turns decisively at the Battle of Yorktown in 1781. British General Charles Cornwallis, surrounded by American and French forces, surrenders. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris officially ends the war, with Britain recognising the independence of the United States. The British Empire has lost its 13 American colonies, a significant blow to its prestige and power. But the empire is far from finished. Even as it loses territory in North America, it's expanding elsewhere. The loss of the American colonies actually accelerates British interest in India, Africa, and the Pacific as alternative sources of imperial wealth and power. In India, the East India Company continues to extend its control. After the Treaty of Allahabad, the company effectively rules Bengal, India's richest province. Under Warren Hastings, the first Governor-General of India, the company begins to function less like a commercial enterprise and more like a government. Company rule brings changes to Indian society and economy. Traditional industries are disrupted as the company promotes goods that can be exported to Britain. Agricultural practices are altered to focus on cash crops. Local power structures are reshaped as the company installs rulers favourable to its interests. "The foreigners change everything," an Indian textile worker complains. "They want us to grow indigo instead of food. They want us to buy their cloth instead of making our own. They want us to become something we are not." For the British, India increasingly becomes the jewel in the imperial crown. The wealth extracted from the subcontinent through trade, taxation, and exploitation helps fuel Britain's industrial revolution and finances further imperial expansion. In Africa, British involvement is still primarily focused on the slave trade and coastal trading posts. The interior of the continent remains largely unexplored by Europeans, but this will change in the coming decades as the scramble for Africa begins. Australia, following Cook's voyage, is identified as a potential site for a new colony. The loss of the American colonies has created a problem for Britain: where to send its convicts. Before the Revolution, many British convicts were transported to America. Now, a new destination is needed. In 1786, the British government decides to establish a penal colony at Botany Bay. The first fleet carrying convicts and their guards arrives in Australia in January 1788, though they actually settle at nearby Sydney Cove rather than Botany Bay. For the convicts, transportation to Australia is a harrowing experience. The voyage takes months, with the ships battling storms, disease, and shortages of food and water. Upon arrival, they face the daunting task of establishing a settlement in an unfamiliar and often hostile environment. God has forsaken this place, one convict writes in a smuggled letter. The sun burns like the fires of hell. Strange creatures lurk in the brush. The natives watch us with suspicious eyes, and our overseers are devils in human form. Despite these challenges, the colony survives and eventually thrives. What begins as a penal settlement will, over time, develop into a significant component of the British Empire. As the 18th century draws to a close, the British Empire is at a crossroads. It has suffered a significant loss with the American Revolution, but continues to expand in other parts of the world. The nature of the empire is changing too, from one primarily focused on trade to one increasingly concerned with territorial control and settlement. The coming century will bring new challenges and opportunities. The Industrial Revolution will transform Britain's economy and society, providing new impetus for imperial expansion. Revolutionary ideas, inspired in part by the American and French revolutions, will spread throughout the empire, challenging traditional notions of authority and hierarchy. And Britain will face new rivals for imperial dominance, particularly from European powers like France and Germany, and eventually from non-European powers like Japan and the United States. But through it all, the British Empire will continue to expand, reaching its zenith in the late 19th and early 20th centuries before the forces it has helped set in motion, nationalism, democracy, anti-colonialism, begin to bring about its decline. As you drift closer to sleep, imagine the vastness of this empire at its height, spanning continents, encompassing diverse peoples and cultures, shaping the modern world in ways both positive and negative. Its legacy lives on in our language, our legal systems, our political institutions, and the very borders of many nations. The story of the British Empire is a complex tapestry of ambition and idealism, exploitation and opportunity, cruelty and courage. It's a story of ordinary people caught in extraordinary historical currents, trying to navigate a changing world. And it's a story that continues to shape our present and future, even as the empire itself has passed into history. As the 19th century dawns, Britain is about to undergo a transformation that will reshape not just the empire, but the entire world. Steam engines hiss and clank in factories across northern England. Coal mines burrow deeper into the earth. Iron foundries glow orange against the night sky. The Industrial Revolution has begun. Imagine walking through Manchester in 1800. The air is thick with coal smoke, so dense that sometimes at midday it's as dark as twilight. Your lungs burn with each breath, your eyes water, soot settles on your clothes, in your hair, even between your teeth. The noise is constant, the metallic clang of machines, the hiss of steam, the shouts of workers, the rumble of carts on cobblestone streets, and beneath it all, the steady thrum of power, not political power, but actual physical energy being harnessed, controlled, directed. It's like the whole world suddenly woke up, a visiting French merchant remarks, and decided to make things. Britain becomes the world's workshop, producing textiles, machinery, ships, and countless other goods at an unprecedented rate. This industrial might fuels imperial expansion, providing both the means, advanced weapons, steam-powered ships, and the motive, need for raw materials and markets for further conquest. One of the first targets is India. The East India Company has been steadily expanding its control since the Battle of Plassey in 1757 under Richard Wellesley, Governor-General from 1798 to 1805. The company adopts a policy of outright territorial acquisition. Wellesley uses a system called subsidiary alliances. Indian rulers who accept these agreements get British protection but must accept a British resident at their court and can't negotiate with other states without British permission. It's protection in the same way that a mob boss protects a local shop owner. The choice is simple, a British official explains to an Indian prince. Accept our friendship or face our enmity. Most choose friendship, which gradually turns into control. By 1818, the company effectively rules most of the Indian subcontinent, either directly or through puppet rulers. For the average Indian, company rule brings significant changes. Traditional industries like textiles are deliberately suppressed to benefit British manufacturers. Local craftspeople, once renowned for their skilled work, find themselves unemployed as cheap, machine-made British goods flood the market. My father made cloth for the Maharaja, a Bengali weaver tells his son. I make cloth for no one. Agricultural practices change too, with emphasis on cash crops like cotton, indigo and opium for export, rather than food for local consumption. This shift increases vulnerability to famine when harvests fail. The British justify their rule with what they call a civilizing mission, the idea that they're bringing progress, education and enlightenment to backward peoples. James Mill, in his influential History of British India, argues that Indian civilization is stagnant and inferior, requiring British guidance to advance. His son, John Stuart Mill, an official in the East India Company, puts it bluntly. Despotism is a legitimate mode of government in dealing with barbarians, provided the end be their improvement. This attitude, equal parts arrogance and paternalism, becomes a hallmark of British imperialism. The British convince themselves they're doing subject peoples a favour by ruling them. Meanwhile, Britain's industrial needs lead to conflict with the world's oldest empire, China. British merchants want to sell their manufactured goods to the vast Chinese market, but the Chinese are mostly self-sufficient and show little interest in British products. There is, however, one British product they do want: opium. Grown in India under company supervision, opium is smuggled into China in massive quantities, creating millions of addicts and draining Chinese silver reserves. When the Chinese government tries to stop this destructive trade, Britain goes to war not once, but twice. The Opium Wars, 1839 to 1842 and 1856 to 1860, end with British victories, forcing China to open its ports to foreign trade and cede Hong Kong to British control. We went to war because they wouldn't let us sell drugs to their people, a British naval officer later admits in his private diary. How do we sleep at night? The Treaty of Nanking, which ends the First Opium War, is the first of what the Chinese will call the unequal treaties, agreements forced upon them by Western powers. It's a pattern that will continue throughout the century, gradually weakening China and contributing to the collapse of its imperial system. In 1837, a young woman named Victoria becomes Queen of the United Kingdom. Her reign, lasting until 1901, will coincide with the zenith of British imperial power. During this Victorian era, the empire expands dramatically, especially in Africa. The early Victorian period sees the abolition of slavery throughout the British Empire in 1833. While morally right, this creates economic challenges for colonies dependent on slave labour, particularly in the Caribbean. Britain's solution is to find new sources of labour-indentured servants from India who sign contracts to work on plantations for a fixed period in exchange for passage and minimal wages. It's not slavery, technically, but conditions are often barely better. "We were promised paradise," an Indian labourer in Trinidad writes home. "We found hell instead." In Africa, Britain's presence is still limited in the early 19th century. There are settlements in Sierra Leone, founded as a haven for freed slaves, and the Cape Colony, taken from the Dutch during the Napoleonic Wars, but the interior remains largely unexplored by Europeans. This begins to change with the voyages of explorers like David Livingstone, who maps much of Central Africa between 1841 and 1873. Livingstone, a Scottish missionary, is driven by a desire to end the slave trade and bring Christianity and commerce to Africa. When Livingstone goes missing for 6 years, the New York Herald sends journalist Henry Morton Stanley to find him. Their meeting near Lake Tanganyika in 1871 produces one of the most famous greetings in history. Dr. Livingstone, I presume. These explorations open the African interior to European knowledge and consequently to European exploitation. By the 1880s, various European powers are scrambling to claim African territories. Back in India, the growing power of the East India Company concerns even the British government. The company has its own army, collects taxes, administers justice, and effectively rules millions of people, all while remaining nominally a commercial enterprise. The contradiction becomes unsustainable in 1857 when a massive rebellion called the Sepoy Mutiny by the British and the First War of Independence by Indian nationalists erupts across northern India. The immediate trigger is a rumour that new rifle cartridges are greased with cow and pig fat, offending both Hindu and Muslim soldiers. But the underlying causes are deeper resentment of foreign rule, fear of Christian proselytizing, anger at economic exploitation. The rebellion is marked by atrocities on both sides. Indian rebels massacre British civilians, including women and children, at places like Cawnpore. British forces respond with indiscriminate violence, executing suspected rebels by tying them to cannon muzzles and firing. "They're hanging everyone with a brown face," a British officer writes in disgust. "No trial, no evidence, just a rope and a tree." After the rebellion is suppressed, the British government decides the East India Company's time is up. The Government of India Act transfers all the company's territories and authorities directly to the British Crown. Queen Victoria becomes Empress of India, ruling the subcontinent through a viceroy and a complex administrative structure staffed largely by the Indian civil service and elite corps of British administrators. This period sees efforts to reform Indian society according to British values. Practices like sati, widow burning, and thuggee, ritual highway robbery and murder, are suppressed. Western education is introduced, creating an Indian elite fluent in English and familiar with Western ideas, including concepts of democracy, nationalism, and self-determination that will eventually be turned against the British. "They teach us about freedom in their schools," an Indian student notes wryly, "then express surprise when we want it for ourselves." The mid-Victorian period also sees Britain involved in European conflicts, most notably the Crimean War, 1853 to 1856, against Russia. This war, fought primarily in the Crimean Peninsula on the Black Sea, is notable for several reasons. It's one of the first wars to be extensively photographed and reported on by war correspondents, bringing the realities of combat home to the British public in unprecedented ways. It introduces Florence Nightingale and her nurses, revolutionising military medicine, and it exposes serious deficiencies in the British military system, leading to reforms. But for the average British soldier, the Crimean War is a nightmare of incompetence and suffering. Men die needlessly of disease and exposure due to inadequate supplies and poor planning. The infamous Charge of the Light Brigade, in which a British cavalry unit charges Russian artillery due to confused orders, becomes emblematic of the war's mismanagement. Ours not to reason why, ours but to do and die. Poet Alfred Lord Tennyson will write about the charge, capturing both the heroism and the futility of the action. Despite these challenges, Britain emerges from the mid-century as the world's predominant power. Its navy rules the waves. Its factories produce goods that flood global markets. London is the world's financial centre, with the pound sterling serving as the international reserve currency. The late Victorian period sees the most dramatic expansion of the British Empire, particularly in Africa. The scramble for Africa begins in earnest after the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885, where European powers establish rules for claiming African territories. The conference's attendees, all European with no African representation, literally draw lines on maps dividing the continent among themselves with little regard for existing political structures, ethnic groupings, or geographic realities. "They're cutting up Africa like a cake," observes one horrified observer. Britain claims vast territories, including what will become Nigeria, Ghana, Kenya, Uganda, and Sudan, among others. Cecil Rhodes, a British businessman and ardent imperialist, establishes British control over what becomes Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe and Zambia. Rhodes dreams of a British Africa stretching from Cape to Cairo, with a railway line connecting these two extremes of the continent. The railway is never completed, but the British do establish a nearly unbroken chain of territories from South Africa to Egypt. For Africans, the imposition of colonial rule is traumatic. Traditional political systems are dismantled or subordinated to colonial administration. Land and resources are expropriated. Labour is coerced through taxation that forces people into the cash economy. "The white man came with a Bible in one hand and a gun in the other," a Kenyan elder later recalls. "He told us to close our eyes and pray. When we opened them, he had the land and we had the Bible." Colonial administrators justify their rule with the same civilizing mission rhetoric used in India. They claim to be bringing progress, Christianity, and commerce to backward peoples. The reality is a system designed primarily to benefit Britain economically and strategically. Yet the empire is not without its critics, even within Britain. Writers like Edmund Burke had criticised imperial excesses in India as early as the 1780s. By the late 19th century, voices like John Hobson are questioning the morality and even the economic value of imperialism. What is this empire for? Hobson asks. Who truly benefits from it? For most ordinary British people, the empire remains distant and abstract. They see it represented in exhibitions, newspapers, and popular culture, exotic animals, strange peoples, thrilling tales of adventure and conquest. But few ever visit the colonies, and fewer still understand the realities of colonial rule. "The sun never sets on the British Empire," goes the popular saying, expressing pride in its global reach. What remains unspoken is the corollary. Somewhere in the empire, it is always darkest night. As the 19th century draws to a close, the British Empire reaches its territorial zenith. It encompasses nearly a quarter of the world's land surface and rules over approximately 450 million people, about 1/4 of the world's population at the time. But beneath this apparent strength, there are signs of strain. Other powers, particularly Germany and the United States, are industrializing rapidly, challenging British economic supremacy. Nationalist movements are stirring in various colonies, inspired partly by Western ideas of self-determination. And the costs of maintaining the empire, military, administrative and moral, are becoming increasingly apparent. The Boer War, 1899 to 1902 in South Africa, exposes the brutality of imperial conquest, with British forces herding Boer civilians into concentration camps where thousands die of disease and malnutrition. We are fighting, a British journalist writes, to maintain our control over people who manifestly do not want to be controlled by us. As you drift closer to sleep, consider the contradictions of the Victorian Empire at its height, the material progress alongside human exploitation, the ideals of liberty and justice alongside the realities of conquest and subjugation, the self-confident assertions of civilizational superiority alongside the often brutal methods used to impose that civilization. The British Empire in this period shapes the modern world in countless ways, drawing borders that still exist today, spreading the English language globally, establishing political and legal institutions that continue to function. Its legacy is complex and contested, inspiring both pride and shame, admiration and anger. And as the 20th century dawns, this empire, the largest in human history, will face challenges that will ultimately lead to its dissolution, returning to the status of the small island nation from which it began. But that's a story for another part of our journey through the rise and fall of the British Empire. As the 20th century dawns, the British Empire stands at its territorial peak. The map of the world is splashed with pink, the colour used to denote British possessions stretching across every continent. 1/4 of the Earth's land surface and 1/4 of its population are under British rule. Queen Victoria, the embodiment of the empire, dies in January 1901 after a 63-year reign. Her son, Edward VII, inherits not just a throne, but a global colossus that seems eternal and unshakable. Yet beneath this apparent strength, cracks are forming. Imagine yourself in London in 1901. The city hums with energy and confidence. Massive buildings of Portland stone line the streets, banks, government offices, museums, all built to last for centuries. The wealth of empire flows through the city's veins. In the shops of Regent Street, you can buy silk from China, tea from India, tobacco from Virginia, coffee from Jamaica, chocolate from West Africa. The century opens with Britain at the pinnacle of world power, declares the Times. What greatness lies ahead, but a different view emerges if you look more closely. In the East End, poverty is rampant. Children with hollow cheeks and ragged clothes beg on street corners. Workers crowd into tenements where disease spreads easily. The wealth of empire enriches some, but certainly not all. And in the colonies themselves, the rumblings of discontent grow louder. In India, the Indian National Congress, founded in 1885, is evolving from a loyal opposition to a more assertive voice for Indian rights and eventually independence. In Ireland, demands for Home Rule intensify. In Africa, the first stirrings of nationalist sentiment emerge among Western-educated elites. The new century also brings new rivals. Germany, unified only since 1871, is industrializing rapidly and building a navy to challenge British maritime supremacy. The United States, having emerged from its civil war as a unified nation, is becoming an economic powerhouse. Japan, transformed by the Meiji Restoration, defeats Russia in 1905, becoming the first Asian power in modern times to defeat a European one. British leaders sense these challenges. Joseph Chamberlain, colonial secretary from 1895 to 1903, proposes imperial preference, a system of tariffs that would bind the empire closer economically. But free trade orthodoxy runs deep in British thinking, and his proposals meet resistance. In 1902, Britain signs an alliance with Japan, recognizing it can no longer maintain naval supremacy in every ocean simultaneously. In 1904, the Entente Cordiale with France ends centuries of Anglo-French rivalry. In 1907, an agreement with Russia completes the Triple Entente. These diplomatic maneuvers reflect a new reality. Britain is no longer strong enough to stand alone. It needs allies. The days of splendid isolation are over, admits Foreign Secretary Lord Lansdowne. The first truly global challenge to the empire comes in 1914 with the outbreak of World War I. Britain enters the conflict after Germany violates Belgian neutrality, but the war quickly becomes a struggle for imperial as well as European dominance. For the average British soldier, many of whom come from working-class backgrounds, the war is a nightmare beyond imagining. In the trenches of the Western Front, men live like animals, knee-deep in mud and filth. Rats grow fat on corpses. Lice infest unwashed bodies. The constant artillery bombardment drives some men mad. The noise never stops, writes a young lieutenant to his mother. Even in sleep I hear it. Will I ever know silence again? Death comes in many forms. Artillery shells, machine gun fire, poison gas, disease. On the first day of the Battle of the Somme, July 1st, 1916, Britain suffers nearly 60,000 casualties, including almost 20,000 dead, the bloodiest day in its military history. The empire mobilizes for this existential struggle. Over 2.5 million Indian troops and laborers serve in the conflict. Soldiers come from Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and the West Indies. Resources flow from every colony to support the war effort. The empire upon which the sun never sets has risen as one to face this challenge, declares Prime Minister Herbert Asquith. But the war strains imperial bonds even as it demonstrates imperial solidarity. In Ireland, nationalists stage the Easter Rising in 1916, brutally suppressed but setting the stage for the Irish War of Independence a few years later. In India, expectations of reward for loyalty and service grow. They use us as cannon fodder, an Indian soldier writes from the Western Front. Will they see us as equals when this is over? For Muslims in the empire, there's a particular dilemma as Britain fights against the Ottoman Empire, whose sultan is the caliph, the spiritual leader of Islam. This creates tensions in India, Egypt, and other Muslim-majority areas under British rule. After 4 devastating years, the war ends in Allied victory. The German, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman and Russian empires all collapse. Britain and its empire seemingly emerge stronger, gaining new territories as mandates from the League of Nations, including Palestine, Iraq, and parts of German East Africa. At the Paris Peace Conference, British dominions, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa signed the Treaty of Versailles separately, recognition of their growing autonomy within the imperial framework. But the cost has been enormous, nearly 1 million dead from Britain and its empire, crushing financial debts and social upheaval. The pre-war world of stability and confidence is gone forever. We have won the war, observes a British diplomat at Versailles, but I'm not sure we have won the peace. The post-war years bring new challenges. In Ireland, the War of Independence, 1919 to 1921, leads to the Anglo-Irish Treaty and the creation of the Irish Free State, with 6 counties in Ulster remaining part of the United Kingdom as Northern Ireland. It's the first significant territorial loss for the empire since American independence. In India, growing nationalist sentiment leads to the Amritsar massacre in 1919 when British troops fire on an unarmed crowd, killing hundreds. The atrocity galvanizes the independence movement under the leadership of Mohandas Gandhi, who advocates non-violent resistance to British rule. The British govern India because we cooperate with them, Gandhi tells his followers. If we withdraw our cooperation, they cannot govern. In Egypt, a 1919 revolution leads to nominal independence in 1922, though Britain retains significant control, particularly over the Suez Canal. In Iraq, a 1920 revolt against the British mandate is suppressed at significant cost. These post-war disturbances reflect a changing world. The principle of self-determination, championed by American President Woodrow Wilson, inspires nationalist movements across the colonized world. The Russian Revolution of 1917 offers an alternative ideology, communism, that explicitly opposes imperialism. The 1926 Imperial Conference produces the Balfour Declaration, not to be confused with the 1917 Declaration on Palestine, which defines Britain and the Dominions as autonomous communities within the British Empire, equal in status, in no way subordinate one to another. This evolving relationship is formalised in the 1931 Statute of Westminster. The Empire is becoming the Commonwealth, a looser association of increasingly independent states with the British monarch as head. Then comes the Great Depression, beginning with the Wall Street crash of 1929. Economic hardship spreads globally, putting further strain on imperial economic relationships. Britain abandons the gold standard in 1931 and finally gives up free trade, introducing imperial preference at the 1932 Ottawa Conference. But the economic benefits of empire are increasingly questioned. Is it really profitable to maintain control over vast territories, or does the cost of administration and defence outweigh the economic advantages? The empire has become a burden we can no longer afford, argues historian Edward Thompson. As if economic troubles weren't enough, a new threat emerges with the rise of fascism in Europe. Benito Mussolini's Italy invades Ethiopia in 1935. Nazi Germany remilitarizes, annexes Austria, and dismembers Czechoslovakia. Imperial Japan expands in Asia. Britain, still recovering from the last war and facing problems throughout its empire, pursues a policy of appeasement, trying to avoid another global conflict. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain returns from Munich in 1938, claiming to have secured peace for our time. The peace lasts less than a year. World War II begins in September 1939 when Germany invades Poland. Britain and France declare war, and the empire is once again called to arms. This second global conflict tests the empire as never before. The fall of France in 1940 leaves Britain standing alone against Nazi Germany. Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who takes office in May 1940, rallies the nation and empire with stirring rhetoric. We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets, we shall fight in the hills, we shall never surrender. The empire responds to the call. Canadian, Australian, New Zealand, South African and Indian forces fight in Europe, North Africa and Asia. Colonial resources again flow to support the war effort, but the war brings unprecedented humiliation as well. Singapore, the supposedly impregnable fortress guarding Britain's Asian possessions, falls to the Japanese in February 1942, the largest surrender in British military history. Japanese forces overrun Malaya, Burma and Hong Kong. In India, the Quit India movement launches in 1942, demanding immediate independence. Though suppressed, it demonstrates growing nationalist strength when Britain asks for Indian support against Japanese forces that have reached India's eastern border. Congress leaders ask, why should Indians die for a freedom they themselves don't have? We are determined to have the freedom that is our right, declares Indian nationalist leader Subhas Chandra Bose. If the British won't give it to us, we will side with their enemies to achieve it. Bose forms the Indian National Army from Indian prisoners of war captured by the Japanese, though it has limited military impact. The war ends in Allied victory in 1945, but Britain emerges exhausted and financially drained. The new superpower rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union leaves little room for a third major power, and throughout the colonized world, demands for independence grow louder. The process of decolonization begins almost immediately. In 1947, India and Pakistan gain independence, ending 3 centuries of British presence in South Asia. The partition of the subcontinent along religious lines leads to massive population transfers and communal violence that claims hundreds of thousands of lives. Lord Mountbatten, the last Viceroy of India, observes the chaos from his residence and reportedly remarks, "At least we're leaving with dignity." An Indian politician retorts, "The only thing leaving with dignity is you, Lord Mountbatten. The rest of us are covered in blood." Burma, now Myanmar, and Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, follow in 1948. The British mandate in Palestine ends in 1948, with the creation of Israel and the First Arab-Israeli War, leaving a legacy of conflict that continues to this day. In Africa, the pace of change is initially slower, but pressure builds. The Gold Coast, now Ghana, achieves independence in 1957 under Kwame Nkrumah, who declares, "We face neither east nor west, we face forward." By the end of the 1950s, the writing is on the wall for the entire British Empire. Prime Minister Harold Macmillan, speaking to the South African Parliament in 1960, acknowledges the wind of change blowing through this continent, recognising that the era of European colonialism is ending. The process isn't always smooth. In Kenya, the Mau Mau uprising, 1952 to 1960, is suppressed with considerable brutality before independence comes in 1963. In southern Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, white settlers unilaterally declare independence in 1965 rather than accept majority rule, leading to international sanctions and eventually a guerrilla war. In Aden, part of modern Yemen, and Cyprus, British forces face armed insurgencies. Malaya, now part of Malaysia, achieves independence in 1957 after a long communist insurgency is defeated. For British officials overseeing this dissolution of empire, it's a bittersweet experience. Many have spent their entire careers in colonial service, genuinely believing in their civilizing mission. Now they watch as the flags come down and their life's work ends. "We arrived with such certainty," a retiring colonial officer in Africa writes in his diary. "We leave with such doubt." For the peoples gaining independence, the moment is one of jubilation, but also uncertainty. Colonial borders, drawn with little regard for ethnic or historical realities, become international boundaries, setting the stage for future conflicts. Colonial economic systems designed to benefit the metropole leave new nations dependent and underdeveloped. "The British have left," observes a Nigerian journalist, "but their ghosts remain." By 1970, most of the British Empire has achieved independence. What remains are a few scattered territories: Gibraltar, the Falklands, a handful of Caribbean and Pacific islands. The Commonwealth provides a forum for cooperation among former colonies, but it's a far cry from the imperial system it replaced. The empire that once ruled a quarter of humanity has largely dissolved, returning to something resembling its original borders. The pink-coloured lands on the map have reclaimed their own identities and destinies. As you drift closer to sleep, consider the dramatic arc of this imperial story, from small island nation to global superpower and back again, all in the span of a few centuries. The British Empire shaped the modern world in countless ways, for better and worse. Its legacy lives on in languages spoken, borders drawn, institutions established, and historical memories formed. It was an empire on which, as the saying went, the sun never set. But like all human creations, it had its morning, its noon, and its evening. And as the imperial sun finally sets, a new world order emerges from its long shadow, a world of nation-states, international organizations, and new forms of power and influence beyond the territorial control that defined the imperial age. By the early 1970s, the British Empire has largely dissolved. The mighty imperial structure that once ruled a quarter of the world's land and population has contracted back to the British Isles, with just a scattering of small territories remaining across the globe. But the story isn't quite over. The final decades of the 20th century see the completion of the decolonization process and a reckoning with the imperial past. It's a quieter, more reflective chapter in the epic tale of the British Empire, a time of endings, transformations, and legacies. On a grey London morning in 1972, a fleet of ships arrives at the Tilbury docks. These aren't the powerful warships or merchant vessels that once projected British power across the oceans. They're small, overcrowded boats carrying Ugandan Asians, British passport holders expelled by dictator Idi Amin. These refugees are part of communities established during imperial rule, when Indians were encouraged to settle throughout the empire as merchants, clerks, and labourers. Now, as newly independent nations assert their identities, these imperial diasporas sometimes find themselves unwelcome. My grandfather came to Uganda because the British wanted him there. A young woman clutching a single suitcase tells a reporter, "Now we come to Britain because nowhere else will have us." For Britain, accepting these imperial refugees is both a moral obligation and a practical challenge. The country itself is struggling with economic problems, inflation, unemployment, industrial unrest. The glory days of imperial power and prosperity seem increasingly distant. Meanwhile, the slow process of decolonization continues. In the Caribbean, former colonies gain independence one by one. Bahamas in 1973, Grenada in 1974, Dominica in 1978, St. Lucia and St. Vincent in 1979, Antigua and Barbuda in 1981, St. Kitts and Nevis in 1983. Each independence ceremony follows a similar pattern. The Union Jack lowered, a new national flag raised, speeches about friendship and cooperation, a sense of both celebration and melancholy. "We were never meant to rule these islands forever," an elderly British governor says privately after one such ceremony, "but I wonder what we were meant to do." The question reflects the ambiguity of the imperial project. Was it about trade, strategic advantage, civilizing mission, or simply power for its own sake? As the empire recedes into history, these questions become more philosophical than practical. In 1976, the British economy is in such dire straits that the government must request a loan from the International Monetary Fund, a humbling moment for a nation that once dominated global finance. The contrast with imperial grandeur couldn't be starker. "We used to lend money to half the world," a Treasury official remarks. "Now we beg for it ourselves." The Falklands War of 1982 provides a brief echo of imperial conflicts past. When Argentina invades the Falkland Islands, one of Britain's few remaining overseas territories, Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher dispatches a naval task force to reclaim them. It's a risky venture. The islands are 8,000 miles from Britain, but just 400 miles from Argentina. The logistics are daunting, the outcome uncertain. For the British soldiers and Marines who fight in the Falklands, the experience is brutal. The South Atlantic winter brings bitter cold, with temperatures dropping below freezing. Sleet and snow driven by howling winds cut through clothing. The boggy ground turns to mud that sucks at boots and makes every step an effort. It feels like the end of the world, a young Royal Marine writes home. Maybe it is. Despite the challenges, British forces succeed in recapturing the islands after a 10-week conflict. The victory boosts national morale, but it's an anomaly in the broader pattern of imperial retreat. In Africa, the final significant colonial holding, southern Rhodesia, where white settlers had unilaterally declared independence rather than accept black majority rule, finally becomes independent Zimbabwe in 1980 after years of guerrilla warfare and international sanctions. Robert Mugabe, leader of one of the main liberation movements, becomes Prime Minister and later President. At independence, he surprises many with a message of reconciliation. If yesterday I fought you as an enemy, today you have become a friend. If yesterday you hated me, today you cannot avoid the love that binds me to you. The warm sentiments won't last as Zimbabwe later descends into authoritarianism and economic collapse. But the moment represents the end of British colonial rule in mainland Africa, a process that began with Ghanaian independence in 1957. The most emotionally significant imperial withdrawal comes in 1997 with the handover of Hong Kong to China. Acquired through the Opium Wars in the 19th century, Hong Kong has become a thriving financial centre and a unique blend of British and Chinese influences. On a rainy night in June 1997, the final British governor, Chris Patten, fights back tears as the Union Jack is lowered for the last time. Prince Charles and Chinese President Jiang Zemin watch as the flags change and sovereignty transfers at midnight. For Hong Kong residents, it's a moment of profound uncertainty. China has promised to maintain the territory's way of life under the one country, two systems framework, but many are sceptical. The British didn't give us democracy until they were leaving, a Hong Kong businessman observes wryly. The Chinese promised to preserve freedoms they themselves don't have. The handover of Hong Kong symbolically marks the end of the British Empire as a significant geopolitical reality. What remains are 14 British overseas territories, places like Bermuda, Gibraltar, the Falkland Islands and St Helena, most of them small islands with tiny populations. As the actual empire fades into history, Britain grapples with its imperial legacy in increasingly complex ways. The Commonwealth, an association of former British colonies and dependencies, evolves from an imperial club into a more egalitarian organisation focused on shared values and cooperation. The Commonwealth Games, held every 4 years, become a visible symbol of these post-imperial connections. Athletes from 72 nations and territories, from India to Tonga, from Canada to Cameroon, compete in a festival of sport that acknowledges shared history while celebrating distinct identities. "We're family," a Jamaican sprinter tells a Scottish competitor at the 2002 Manchester Games. Dysfunctional sometimes, but still family. Within Britain itself, the relationship with the imperial past becomes more complicated. Immigration from former colonies, particularly from South Asia, the Caribbean and Africa, transforms British society, making it more diverse, but also generating tensions and backlash. The Windrush scandal that emerges in 2018 highlights these complexities. Caribbean immigrants who arrived in Britain between 1948 and 1971, invited to help rebuild post-war Britain, suddenly face deportation threats because they lack documentation proving their right to remain, despite having lived in the UK for decades. They wanted our labour then, an elderly Barbadian man says. They don't want us now. The scandal forces a national conversation about immigration, identity, and the obligations owed to people from former colonies. In museums, universities, and public discourse, the imperial past becomes a battleground for competing interpretations. Some emphasize the positive aspects: infrastructure development, the spread of English language and literature, the establishment of educational and legal institutions. Others focus on exploitation, racism, cultural destruction, and the violence often used to establish and maintain imperial rule. The debate extends to physical symbols of empire. Statues of imperial figures like Cecil Rhodes become focal points for protests. Should these monuments remain as historical artifacts, be removed as offensive glorifications of oppression, or be recontextualized with additional information about their complex legacies? We can't erase history, argues a British historian, but we can try to understand it more fully. For former colonies, the imperial legacy is equally complex, the borders drawn by European powers, often with little regard for ethnic, linguistic, or historical realities, remain as international boundaries, creating challenges for national unity and regional stability. Colonial economic systems designed to extract resources for the benefit of the metropole leave lasting structural inequalities. Languages imposed by imperial rule, particularly English, become both tools of global communication and reminders of cultural domination. Yet the influence flows both ways. Britain itself has been profoundly shaped by its imperial experience. Curry has become a national dish. Words from Hindi, Arabic, and African languages enrich English vocabulary. Literature, music, and art reflect multicultural influences. The physical landscape of Britain bears imperial imprints from the grand buildings of colonial administrators returned home to the collections of global artifacts in museums, from streets named after imperial victories to monuments celebrating, or now questioning, imperial heroes. The empire didn't just change the world, reflects a British Nigerian writer. It changed Britain too, in ways we're still discovering. As the 21st century progresses, Britain seeks a new place in the global order. No longer an imperial power, it navigates relationships with rising nations, some of them former colonies like India that now have larger economies than their former ruler. The 2016 Brexit referendum, where Britain votes to leave the European Union, is interpreted by some as nostalgia for imperial greatness, a desire to be independent again rather than part of a larger union. Others see it as simply a preference for global rather than regional connections. Global Britain becomes the post-Brexit slogan, emphasising ties with Commonwealth countries alongside new trade relationships around the world. It's an echo of imperial networks, but now as a relationship among equals rather than a hierarchy of ruler and ruled. For the former colonies themselves, attitudes toward Britain and its imperial legacy vary widely. Some maintain close cultural, educational, and economic ties. Others have deliberately distanced themselves, looking to different models and partners. We respect our history, says a Malaysian politician, but we're writing our own future. The Commonwealth evolves to reflect these changing dynamics. In 2018, Prince Charles succeeds Queen Elizabeth II as the organisation's head, not automatically, but by consensus of the member states. The Commonwealth Charter emphasises democracy, human rights, tolerance and sustainable development as shared values, with no mention of past imperial relationships. As the actual lived experience of empire recedes further into history, its evaluation becomes both more objective and more contested. Historians uncover new sources telling stories of both ordinary people and major figures previously overlooked. Fiction, film, and other media reimagine imperial experiences from multiple perspectives. The British Empire, like all human creations, was neither wholly good nor wholly evil. It was a complex system built by people with mixed motives, operating according to the assumptions and values of their times. It brought technological development and educational opportunities to some, exploitation and cultural disruption to others. It connected distant parts of the world, creating networks of trade, migration, and ideas that persist long after imperial rule has ended. It spread English as a global language, Westminster-style parliamentary systems as a model of governance, and sports like cricket and football as cultural touchstones across continents. But it also imposed foreign rule on peoples who didn't choose it, extracted wealth that benefited primarily the imperial power, and established racial hierarchies whose psychological impacts outlast their formal structures. The empire was neither the glorious civilizing mission of Victorian mythology nor the unmitigated evil of its harshest critics, a contemporary historian writes. It was human history on a global scale with all the complexity that implies. As you lie in your comfortable bed, drifting towards sleep, think about the extraordinary journey we've taken through the rise and fall of the British Empire, from its beginnings in the struggle against Viking invaders, through its expansion across continents, to its zenith as global superpower, and its gradual dissolution. We've witnessed one of history's great epics. We've seen kings and queens, governors and viceroys, soldiers and settlers, missionaries and merchants, but we've also glimpsed the experiences of ordinary people, farmers and weavers, sailors and servants, those who ruled and those who were ruled. The story of the British Empire is, in many ways, the story of our modern world. The international system of nation-states, the global spread of the English language, the borders of countries across Africa and Asia, the multicultural nature of societies from Canada to Singapore, all bear the imprint of this historical force. Understanding this imperial story helps us make sense of our present world, with its patterns of wealth and poverty, power and resistance, connection and division. It reminds us that current realities have deep historical roots, and that today's decisions will shape tomorrow's possibilities. As sleep approaches, bringing its own form of empire, the realm of dreams where past and present mingle, freely reflect on how history lives within us all. The empires of yesterday have shaped the world we inhabit, just as today's choices will shape the world of generations to come. The British Empire has passed into history, its flags lowered, its anthems faded, but its legacy remains in languages spoken, borders drawn, institutions established and memories preserved. It's a legacy as complex and contradictory as humanity itself. A tapestry of achievement and failure, creation and destruction, connection and conflict. And as you finally drift into the empire of sleep, remember that history is never truly finished. The story continues, shaped by all who inherit its consequences and choose its future directions. The British Empire has ended, but the human story it was part of continues, with all its tragedy and triumph, its darkness and light. Rest now, with the weight of history settled comfortably around you, neither too heavy to bear nor too light to forget. Tomorrow is another day, another page in the ongoing story of human civilization, a story in which we are all, in our own small ways, both subjects and authors.